Today's story was very public and caused a lot of sensation. Let's look at all the circumstances of the case. Human cruelty sometimes exceeds all imaginable limits. The victim of our story today died a painful death in a fire. But the saddest part is that this all happened because of a loved one who betrayed her. Kimberly Antonakos was born in 1974 in New York, USA, and was the only child of the family. Her father, Thomas, was a tall, successful businessman. He initially dealt with real estate, but later, after their daughter was born, he began working with computers. This field was very promising. The family had more than enough money, and the loving father readily used it to fulfill his child's every wish. After some time, the parents divorced, and the child was left with her mother. During this time, she was only 1 year old. The girl had contact with her father only on weekends. Thomas cherished these short moments when he could take his daughter and spend free time with her. A few years later, the girl's mother decided to move to Florida, where she found a new man and wanted to start a family with him. At this time, the mother gave the girl the option to choose with whom she wanted to stay. Kimberly decided not to leave New York, where she had grown up, and so the daughter began to live with her father, with whom she got along very well. The daughter even jokingly asked her father not to remarry so that their relationship would not change negatively. When Kimberly was 20 years old, she was studying at college. She was considered an intelligent and lovable young beauty who was a lot of fun, open, sociable, and even a bit naive. Her parents surrounded her with care throughout her childhood, literally not letting her struggle with difficulties and solving everything for her. The dark sides of the world and people, all possible problems, passed by the young beauty, and thanks to this, she had an open heart. In 1994, Kimberly wanted to move into her own apartment and live alone. She asked her father, who was initially against it because he was very worried about his daughter's safety. But at the same time, he understood that she had to become independent and build her own life. The daughter was already 20 years old. He still cared for her and was very afraid for her, but he did not want to upset his daughter, so he agreed anyway. Later, they went into the city to look for suitable accommodation. For safety reasons, the man chose an apartment for her that was in a safe neighborhood of the city, and almost immediately after her move, he also bought her a garage space across the street so she could park her car. To stay in touch with her, her father gave her a mobile phone. It should be noted that we are talking about events that took place in the mid-1990s, before the advent of modern mobile phones and the active development of messaging apps. Back then, mobile phones looked different and didn't have the functions they have today. But the most important thing was that they offered the possibility to stay in touch with loved ones at any time. Computers were also not yet so widespread that it was not easy and was very expensive to get a mobile phone. This shows how much Thomas cared about his daughter's safety and how much effort he made. He even bought Kimberly a pit bull puppy because he assumed that his daughter would feel more comfortable with it, that the dog would grow up and protect her. The father had reason to worry, as he had protected his daughter for years and had more than once experienced how she chose unfortunate friends who hurt her. The man wanted to make sure she was safe, not knowing what hard trial life had in store for her. Thomas worried about Kimberly and repeatedly told his daughter that he wanted her to come back and live with him. He also offered her a job in the family business, but she refused because she wanted to find her own way in life. The father never pressured his daughter and wanted to give her free choice. Kimberly lived a typical college life during this time, with parties and entertainment and the desire to be free without parental supervision. She had recently taken a part-time job as an accountant in an office, but the people she trusted turned out to be real traitors. Unfortunately, she did not suspect what cruel end awaited her. On February 28, 1995, Kim went to another party. Usually, she went to such events with her friend Liz Pace. Here, the young women danced and had fun. The next day, March 1st, Kimberly was supposed to go to work, but her colleagues noticed her absence. They began to worry, and eventually, Kimberly's manager called her father. The employee began to speculate that Kimberly was simply sick and couldn't report to the office. But instead of confirming that his daughter was at home, Thomas panicked. Moreover, he hadn't heard from her since the evening of February 28th. The man tried to reach his daughter, but she didn't respond. He contacted all the friends of his daughter that he knew, but no one had seen her since she left the party early in the morning of March 1st. The alarmed father decided not to wait and immediately turned to the police. But unfortunately, he also received the usual response. The police officers noted that it was a young woman who had disappeared after a party. She was an adult and could do as she pleased. Legally, she could have stayed overnight at a friend's place and returned later. At least 24 hours would have to pass before she could be considered missing. This answer, of course, did not satisfy Thomas. So he organized his own search party, which included his daughter's friends. They first went to the parking lot near Kimberly's apartment. Here, it looked like she hadn't returned from the party. Her car, a '94 Honda Accord that her father had given her, was not in her parking spot. She was also not in the apartment. With this information, the man went back to the police station and insisted that something had happened to his daughter. The police officers, however, were unyielding. He searched various places where Kimberly could be and spoke to many people, paying special attention to the police officers and trying to draw law enforcement's attention to what had happened, until he finally met an investigator who was interested in the mysterious disappearance of the businessman's daughter. Like Thomas, he immediately had the feeling that something was wrong in this case despite the protocol. He said that immediate action was necessary and decided to personally help the father of the missing woman. The first thing the investigator had to do was to rule out all possible versions of the events. To do this, it was necessary to discard the possibility that she had run away from home. The investigator analyzed the transactions on the woman's bank card. It turned out that the missing woman had not used the card since the evening before her disappearance. The investigator called all the friends of the missing woman, but no one had seen her after her disappearance and did not know where she was. The police officer then determined the woman's daily routine to find out what she had done the day before. Perhaps there were some clues here. Quickly, it turned out that Kimberly had, on the morning before her disappearance on February 28th, attended college classes as usual. After the end of the school day, the student went to her work. After working a few hours, she contacted her friend Liz Pace. The two always went to parties together. They went to a party where they celebrated and had a few drinks, and around 4 a.m., they decided it was time to part ways. They then drove together in Kimberly's car to Liz's house, which was literally just a few blocks from Kimberly's apartment. Liz went home, and the missing woman set off for her apartment. Her friend never saw her again, so it was known that Kimberly had driven her car, even in a drunken state. Nevertheless, it was important to understand what happened to Kimberly after she dropped off Liz and drove to her parking spot. For this purpose, the police officer went to the missing woman's house and searched the garage area. The investigator tried to find any traces or markings that could help reconstruct the events of the morning when Kimberly disappeared. The only thing the investigator could find was a gold earring. The father confirmed that it belonged to his daughter's jewelry when he showed it to him. Liz confirmed that Kimberly had worn these earrings at the party. There were no signs of a struggle or tire tracks from drivers accelerating or stopping. The car seemed to have been stolen very calmly. But the found earring unsettled the investigators, and the suspicion arose that this was how the burglar made his profit. At this point, other police officers were involved in the case, as there was every reason to believe that Kimberly had been kidnapped. To find the white Honda, the police officers began to search scrap yards and all places where the car could be dismantled for parts or sold. But everything was in vain. The vehicle seemed to have disappeared. To get more help with the investigation, Thomas turned to his lawyers and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In fact, apart from the white Honda, there were few clues. Thanks to her friend Liz, it was possible to determine what clothes the missing woman had worn. And from her words, a portrait was created to notify the city's citizens and gather information. The investigators also learned that she had 2 tattoos. One was an infinity sign with a naked couple in it. The second tattoo showed a scorpion, her zodiac sign. The police officers then decided to gain access to the woman's mobile phone. For this purpose, they went to the woman's apartment, where there was a landline phone from which 65 calls had been made on the morning of the disappearance. But not even that caught the officers' attention, but rather the fact that Kimberly's apartment was not empty. It even hosted guests, namely, a whole family. April, her boyfriend Joshua Torres, and their 2-year-old child lived there. The family admitted that during this time, the floor in their apartment was being renovated, and they didn't know where to stay during the renovation work. But Kimberly welcomed them by providing them with a guest room. As it turned out, they had already been living there for several weeks before the investigators arrived. The family was also worried about the disappearance of the apartment owner and said that they had not heard from her since the evening when Kimberly went to the party. This all seemed very strange. The father of the missing woman knew about the befriended family that his daughter had taken in and had always been against it, but Kimberly didn't want to listen to him. She was reliable and couldn't let her friend down. Of course, the couple was questioned first, and the investigators wanted to know why so many calls had been made on the morning of the disappearance of the landlord. Joshua claimed he had started calling all of Kimberly's friends and acquaintances when the woman didn't come home on time. According to him, the student was like a little sister to him, so he took care of her and was worried about her disappearance. Kimberly's mother was informed about the incident on the second day after her daughter's disappearance and flew in immediately from Florida. The woman stayed in Kimberly's apartment, and the cohabiting family was asked to move out. They continued to be treated as suspects. The mother of the missing woman participated in the search for her daughter, and a friend advised her to contact a clairvoyant who could say more about the probable fate of the woman. In her desperation, the woman took up this idea. When the woman visited the clairvoyant, she showed her photos of her daughter and asked for help. The clairvoyant said that Kimberly was still alive but in great danger. Therefore, the search should not be delayed. The missing woman was weak and dehydrated. Moreover, Kimberly had been kidnapped by people she knew. Kimberly had tried to escape captivity but had been caught and tied up again. The clairvoyant kept repeating that she had seen the letter J in one of the perpetrators' names. Apparently, the main culprit in the events, the kidnapper, was a young man whose name began with this letter. The mother of the missing woman passed this information on to the police. It was even the only information the investigators had at this point, and they decided to use this lead. The next day, it was broadcast everywhere in the New York news and caused a stir in society. And soon, there was a new turn in the case. On March 4th, around 2 a.m., a major fire broke out on 68th Street in Woodhaven, Queens. A witness to the incident later said that shortly before the fire, he had been walking his dog, which behaved very nervously near the house and barked at it for a long time, even though the property seemed quiet. It was an abandoned house, but it was very large, so the fire attracted attention and several fire units were needed to fight the fire. When the fire was finally extinguished, the police and firefighters began to search the ashes, as it seemed that really no one lived here. But in the basement, an unpleasant discovery awaited them. Below lay a burned corpse that was so badly burned that one could hardly recognize it as a woman with long dark hair. The worst part was that she was tied to a chair. The medical examiners confirmed that the dead woman's hands and feet were bound, that she wasn't wearing shoes, and that her hands were still tied behind her back even after her death. So it was clearly a murder. It was determined that she was still alive when the fire broke out. Her lungs seemed filled with smoke. This means that she was burned alive. During the investigation, it turned out that an intruder had poured a flammable liquid over the house and then set it on fire. Due to the poor condition of the body, it was difficult to identify the victim. They assumed that the burned person was the missing Kimberly. To identify the body, dental records were needed. To do this, the investigator contacted the father of the missing woman and expressed his suspicion. When examining the mortal remains, experts found tattoos that were identical to those described by Kimberly and a match with the dental records, confirming the investigators' fears. The police tried to take fingerprints in the garage where the victim's car was supposed to be parked and at the scene of the fire. However, the forensic scientists were unsuccessful. The traces were simply not present. They were thoroughly wiped away, or the kidnapper wore gloves. It was now clear why a neighbor had always stopped with his dog in recent days when the animal had become restless. Kimberly desperately wanted to free herself and call for help, so she made noises that the animal could hear but were not perceptible to the human ear. The police officers immediately contacted the owner of the burned-down house. He was shocked by what had happened. He had offered the house for sale a long time ago and had not been there himself anymore, but from time to time his employees came to check the condition of the house. He took a quick look at the doors and windows to make sure everything was in order and also picked up the mail. In those days when Kimberly was being held in the basement, he also appeared here as usual. He inspected the house from the outside, picked up the letters and the payment notices, and then simply left again. Since he was outside, he could not hear the woman because of the city noise, who was probably calling for help at that very moment. The man would have only had to go into the basement. Then he would have immediately noticed that something was wrong. Unfortunately, the man did not do that. Kimberly was a step away from being rescued, but that didn't help. Since all possible evidence was burned, the victim's family and the police were forced to turn to a clairvoyant again. This time, the woman said she could see 4 people who might be involved in the events, and she repeated again that the name of one of them began with the letter J. But the clairvoyant statement alone was not enough to find the murderer. The father of the victim offered a reward of $75,000 for information leading to the capture of the perpetrator. The police continued to investigate and found out that the father had returned to his house on the day of his daughter's disappearance and listened to the answering machine recordings. Here, there were 2 strange calls when there was silence on the other end of the line. They later played an important role in the case. In the meantime, the investigators speculated that it could have been Kimberly who tried to contact her father, or that the burglars might have called him to demand a ransom. But something prevented them. Perhaps there were communication problems. When the public learned what had happened, numerous rumors arose that even accused the father of the murdered woman, Thomas, of being responsible for his daughter's death. Some claimed he was a wealthy businessman with connections to the local mafia. The police checked this information and, despite the businessman's denial, could prove that he actually had no connections to crime. Kimberly's car was soon found. The vehicle had been parked for several days in one of the city's quiet streets, quite far from the scene of the fire. The residents did not know that the car was being searched for, as no one had officially reported it. But since the car had no owner, the investigators found the second gold earring of Kimberly when they arrived at the scene and examined the interior and trunk of the car. Hair and fingerprints were also found. After that, however, the investigation stalled for a long half-year. In September 1995, new witnesses came forward, a man and a woman who reported to the police. The couple claimed that their mutual friend had bragged about the massacre of Kimberly. They told about the 22-year-old Joshua Torres, the same young man whom Kimberly had taken in. The investigators then met with him again and decided to ask him some questions. He began to tell that on the morning of Kimberly's disappearance, he had called many of her friends. The only one who didn't answer the phone was a Russian guy. According to him, he was one of the ex-boyfriends of the woman. Joshua claimed that the missing woman was afraid of him. He also told the police that on the day Kimberly disappeared, he had seen a group of suspicious Russians driving through the neighborhood where they lived. After Thomas found out about this, he decided to continue his investigations. He drove to the address where the man lived to speak to him personally. But he was not there. Instead, the man managed to talk to the young man's neighbors. They all agreed that he was a rather unpleasant person who didn't communicate much with others. But no one could help find him. Only the next day did Thomas confront the man and was able to persuade him to make a statement at the police station. There, the investigators found a tattoo on his leg with the abbreviation Kim, which presumably originated during the relationship with the victim. However, the young man denied this and stated that the tattoo was dedicated to his close childhood friend. After a short interrogation, The investigators did not find anything unusual. The young man claimed to have nothing to do with Kimberly's murder and had a solid alibi that was confirmed. The investigators were convinced that he had nothing to do with the crime. The police officers analyzed the calls made from Kimberly's apartment when she disappeared. It turned out that Joshua had lied. He claimed he had called the pager of the young man. These were widespread in the USA at that time and were used instead of cell phones. It turned out that Joshua had sent several suspicious messages on that fateful morning while he was in the missing woman's apartment. The man claimed he just wanted to stay in touch with friends and made some evasive comments. Joshua's behavior became increasingly suspicious. By the way, his name began with the letter J, and this letter was repeatedly referred to by the clairvoyant who had been contacted by the mother of the deceased. After the investigators learned more about him, they found out that the young man had no job. He lived off his girlfriend's money and took care of the child while she worked. All this made him an ideal candidate for the role of a kidnapper. He could, in his free time, plan a crime, locate the victim, and bring her to the abandoned house to demand a ransom. But something went wrong, and the perpetrator was forced to destroy all evidence in a hurry, along with Kimberly. The investigators told Joshua that they did not consider Kim's former Russian boyfriend a suspect in this case. He was grilled, and the man talked. Joshua began to tell a new story. He suspected that his friends might be involved in the events. In this case, it was about 3 men who had kidnapped Kimberly in the parking lot and put her in the trunk. The first was Julio, an acquaintance. Friends confirmed that he had been together with Kimberly for some time and even wanted to marry her. However, she was not interested in such a relationship, and the couple separated. Under police pressure, he confessed to being an accomplice in the kidnapping. He said he didn't know they would kill her. The kidnappers just wanted a ransom because they needed the money and wanted to release the victim, but the plan didn't work out. The police were able to confirm the suspicion relatively quickly. April remembered that Joshua and his friends were watching TV on the day Kimberly was reported missing. When the news about the suspect, whose name began with the initial of his name, was broadcast, one of them stood up, hurried out, and called the others after him. It was the 19-year-old Nicholas Liberté, who had the nickname Jay. Later that day, the body of the missing woman was found in the basement of the burned-down house. Could it be that the kidnappers were frightened by the excitement and burned the woman to leave no traces? In this group was also the 20-year-old Jose Rodriguez, who was not related to Joshua, although he had the same surname. All the people involved in the case, who later became suspects, were friends of Joshua. All had dark sides in their past that were associated with criminal matters. However, these were minor offenses that paled in comparison to the brutality inflicted on Kimberly. It was found that Nicholas had been released on bail before the kidnapping. He was still under police surveillance. On the eve of Kimberly's murder, he broke into a friend's house and tried to rob his mother at gunpoint. Instead of a 5-year prison sentence for such an offense, he got away with a $1,000 fine, thanks to his mother, who hired a good lawyer for her son. Apparently, Nicholas was then seized by a sense of impunity and therefore decided to carry out a more lucrative plan: the kidnapping of a businessman's daughter. The police found that Joshua was the initiator of this crime. He was the one who decided that it was possible to kidnap a rich woman who was a friend's friend and demand ransom from her father. The man controlled Kimberly's movements and warned the accomplices when she was supposed to return from the party. It turned out that Joshua had a rather turbulent criminal past. He had kidnapped children since he was 17 years old, but was quickly caught and arrested. Due to his young age and the complexity of the case, however, he only received 5 years probation. Later, Joshua was arrested for sexual assault of a minor, but only served 60 days in jail. A year later, he was again imprisoned for 18 months, this time for illegal possession of a firearm. It turned out that he formed a gang with his friends, whose members were called Mixed Breed. Unfortunately, the leader of the gang, Joshua, disappeared after he had contacted the police. The police officers decided to talk to Joshua's roommate, April. As it turned out, he used his girlfriend as an alibi. The man coordinated the actions of the criminals who were in the house. In fact, the criminal abducted the friend behind the back of his beloved, but she didn't even suspect it. Thanks to the messages on the pager and the testimonies of the criminals, the police were able to understand their criminal plan in detail. It also became known that they had followed Kimberly to the party. There, they behaved quietly and inconspicuously and simply waited for her to go home and immediately followed her. The 4 kidnappers were identified, but by this time, one of the people involved in the massacre, Jose Rodriguez, was already dead. On June 23rd, 3 months after Kimberly's death, he was attacked on the street while walking with a baby in his arms. He was shot in the back of the head from behind. No one saw the moment of the attack, but there was reason to believe that this was Joshua's way of silencing his accomplice, as he knew that Jose regretted it and wanted to go to the police. The remaining 3 were arrested and charged with murder, arson, kidnapping, and holding a person against their will. Later, they were able to talk to each other and create a complete picture of the events. In the garage where they waited for Kim after the party, the perpetrators used a gun and duct tape. The woman resisted when they attacked her. She kicked and scratched the intruders, even broke her nails. However, her strength was not enough, and she was tied up with duct tape, with her mouth, eyes, and even ears taped shut. Then she was completely immobilized and thrown into the trunk. The perpetrators brought the victim to an abandoned house, lowered her into the basement, and tied her to a chair. They took off her shoes so she couldn't draw attention to herself. They told her that her father owed them money and then left Kimberly there for the next 3 days. The leader of the gang instructed Julio to go into the house and take care of the woman, give her something to eat and drink. However, since he was afraid of being caught by the police, he did not do so. As a result, the woman neither drank nor ate, was freezing, and begged for help. Immediately after she was brought to the abandoned house, the criminals informed Joshua that everything was ready. Then he made a tape recording in which he demanded $75,000 as ransom. Joshua called Kim's father and played this recording on the answering machine. However, he did not choose the right time, so the recording was silenced. As a precaution, Joshua called again, but again, the timing was wrong, so no one heard the ransom demand and didn't know that the criminals were waiting for the money. Kim could hardly breathe through her taped mouth. She repeatedly lost consciousness, but was still fighting for her life. In the meantime, the kidnappers hadn't heard anything from the victim's father. They hadn't even noticed that he hadn't received their messages. Instead of checking whether everything was going according to plan, they became angry. Since the burglars never received the ransom, they decided to let Kimberly go. They went into the basement, but found Kimberly lifeless. Later, medical examiners found out that this was not the case. She had only lost consciousness due to exhaustion, cold, and lack of food and drink. In the days when no one was watching over her or giving her anything to eat, she had become very cold and weak. They had previously wanted to burn down the house to erase their tracks, but now it was decided to do so along with the hostage to eliminate any evidence. The public called the crime the most brutal in the history of Queens, and there were calls for the death penalty, which, however, was banned in the state. The most controversial defendant in this case was Joshua. He was not directly involved in the massacre, although he coordinated the actions of the gang members. His girlfriend, April, testified against him in court. She said he had personally confessed to her what had happened. After he had run her over to silence her, he went on the run, and the police had to try to lure the perpetrator out with a trick. They also used April for this. When questioned, Joshua said that he was neither involved nor complicit in the massacre of Kim and that the others involved, who were his friends, were the guilty ones. When he learned this, he decided to cooperate with the investigators and told everything. He repeated what he said in court. Thus, Joshua was found guilty on several counts, except for murder. He was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Nicholas received the same sentence and went to prison for 58 years. Julio, who was only found guilty of aiding and abetting murder, received a prison sentence of between 2 and 6 years. On his daughter's regular birthday, which took place after the conclusion of the trial, her father Thomas came to the grave to rejoice with Kimberly that he had finally been able to punish the guilty. Kim's father fought against the bitterness of loss until the end, but he died of cancer in 2005. Many were still convinced that the brutal crime had undermined the health of a loving father. Nicholas was mistreated and attacked in prison. 2 years after the start of his imprisonment, he died of AIDS. Julio served his sentence and was released 2 years later. Joshua can only be released in the year 2053. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.